people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
De la noche, Stephanie Piñeiro.
Welcome to the motherfucking relay. We're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. Ahead of his upcoming title defense against his mandatory challenger, Callum Smith, top-ranked president feels Beterbiev versus Smith will answer the big question on BetterBeef. People are starting to wonder how much longer will this run continue for Artur, the most dominant light heavyweight champion. Top-ranked president Todd Duboff, who promotes BetterBeef, feels the Smith bout will answer a lot of questions about his man. I think it's a little bit of the Lomachenko riddle. You're looking at two guys into their mid to late 30s who had incredible amateur careers and a body of work that as a pro and an amateur was incredible, said Duboff to Sky Sports. The question is there a time when the high-powered Ferrari doesn't run anymore, and it starts to run a little slower than it used to run? Artur would be that Ferrari? Is that what we see when BetterBeef showed some vulnerability against Anthony Yarde? Was it that he's not as fine-tuned as he was 2 years ago, or that the style of Yarde gave him difficulties? That's the real question. Smith, who was a world champion at super middleweight, has been blasting out opponents since moving up to 175 in 2021. For the UK, it's bombs away. You're talking about Artur Beterbiev, who has an incredible reputation globally, but just comes off a fight where, in the UK, here in the UK, and he knocks people out, Duboff said. Callum Smith is a great knockout puncher as well, who comes from here. The match gets right to the heart of the fight fans here and general sports fans. Whenever you see a fight between two guys with dynamite in their hands, it's always exciting and will keep you on the edge of your seat. Artur is at that age where every single time he gets out there, people have questions. How long can he keep this up? When will Father Time finally catch up to him? Artur Beterbiev's trainer has not seen a slowdown or decline in the gym. In truth, I feel like people are reading a little bit too much into that Anthony Yarde fight. I don't feel like Artur looked any more vulnerable in that fight than he did in the Vosdick fight back in 2018, and that was years ago. As previously reported on BoxingScene.com, Beterbiev's head trainer Mark Ramsey has a lot of respect for Smith and views him as perhaps the toughest opponent of his boxer's career. It is possibly the biggest challenge of his career. We're talking about a guy similar to Alexander Vosdick, who was also quite a challenge. Vosdick had to come to beat Adonis Stevenson in Quebec. I see him a little more physical, with perhaps the same technical level. Smith is easily in the top two, Ramsey explained. It's good that Mark Ramsey is giving Callum his flowers and giving him that much respect, that he identifies him as a credible threat. That will manifest in Artur's preparation, that they're not looking past Callum. As Artur's coach, you can understand all the advantages of doing the event here. There is support of the crowd, but also logistical aspects. He is happy, but he is also conscious of the moment. We have traveled a lot in recent years. He knows the complexity of boxing outside the country, going to perform and winning outside of the country. He knows the advantage it can give us, Ramsey said. Some critics believe Beterbiev, 38 years old, is starting to show his age. Talking about the Anthony Yarde fight earlier this year. I'm not as settled on that as some people, because ahead of the fight, while I picked Artur to win the fight and win the fight by way of knockout, stylistically I anticipated that Anthony had the right style for the job, just not the right level of experience. That he would give Artur some problems, but eventually he'd wilt. He'd give out. Can't say that I feel Artur looked his age in that fight more than Anthony put up the fight that I expected him to. Mark Ramsey continued, At the moment, there is no slowdown in the gym. We do not see it in terms of his metabolism and in terms of his performance either. As long as it goes well like that, we will continue to move forward.
Can we trust Mark to be honest with the pundits that if there were noticeable slowdown in Artur, that he would broadcast that to the boxing community ahead of another mandated title fight?
Any trainers do you know are going to broadcast it to the world that my guy's getting old?
But is Artur getting old?
None of us are getting any younger, but to say that Artur is showing signs of slippage based on the Yarde fight, I'm ambivalent about that.
He's fighting Callum Smith now.
Eddie Hearn is expecting Callum Smith to get the violent knockout win over Artur Beterbiev. The thing is that this isn't Lenin Castillo.
No.
This isn't Matthew Bowder-Leek. This is Artur Beterbiev, the strongest finisher at the weight and one of the strongest finishers in the entire sport.
This is a little different.
Callum Smith is gonna knock Beterbiev's spark out, said Hearn to Fight Hub TV. He's definitely slipping. He's 39 years old. Not quite 39 just yet. Beterbiev is 38. Still looks like the monster that came onto the scene several years ago.
Callum's done a good job of racking up highlight reel knockouts in his light heavyweight campaign. The thing is that he's only 2 to 3 fights into it. He's only had 2 fights as a light heavyweight.
Feels like he's been up there a while, though in reality, as a light heavyweight, he's only fought 2 times, and the 2 guys that he did fight, Lenin Castillo, Olympian Matthew Bowder-Leek.
I mean, it's good that Callum beat them and beat them the way that he did, but you're telling me that Anthony Yarde couldn't have knocked those 2 guys out?
Joe Smith Jr., he couldn't put away Matthew Bowder-Leek. Matthew's been put away before he fought Callum Smith. That Joe Smith Jr. couldn't have put away Lenin Castillo?
Come on.
Just telling you, Artur is a far cry from the 2 guys that Callum has fought so far. He's going to be up against the ropes. Beterbiev is going to come like he does. He's going to square up his feet, and Callum is going to do what he does best, which is the catch and counter left hook. 1-punch knockout. I do feel if Callum can land that left hook, or if he can land that straight right hand, he has enough power to hurt Artur Beterbiev. I do think he actually has enough power to knock him out. But will he be brave enough to let his hands go?
Much smaller fighters and lighter punches than Artur Beterbiev. Got a lot of respect from Callum, mid-range to inside. He's got the power to hurt Artur, I think.
But will he roll the dice? Will he take the chance? Artur Beterbiev is a 2-handed puncher. He's got power in either hand, and he sets a feverish pace for a fight.
Callum's got enough power, I think, to hurt Artur Beterbiev, but your power is only as good as your ability to deliver it, your ability to land. If you can't land, it doesn't even matter.
You can't deliver that power if you don't land, and you can't land if you don't throw. Given the kind of power that Artur Beterbiev has, he might elicit the same, if not more respect than John Ryder did, than Canelo Alvarez did when they fought Callum Smith at a lower weight.
Sounds like Eddie Hearn is giving Callum Smith little more than just a puncher's chance. A catch and counter left hook that he may or may not throw, which may or may not land.
Sure, Callum, if he lands, he can hurt Artur. But the same is true in reverse. If Artur lands, he can definitely hurt Callum Smith. I mean, I think Canelo Alvarez knocked the goddamn muscles.
Was going to town on Callum Smith's arms.
Callum tucked behind a high guard, and Canelo Alvarez brutalized his arms.
He did.
Quite deliberately.
To hamper his ability to throw punches, and it worked. Artur
Could do the same or worse. If Canelo Alvarez battered your arms, what would Artur Beterbiev do to him if you stay tucked away behind that high guard, fought too long? I still favor Artur to win the fight.
Age and everything. Artur's still a favorite in my eyes.
Just in keeping with the theme of all things light heavyweight, former WBO champion Joe Smith Jr. says if he had it his way, he would be fighting Anthony Yarde next. But apparently, he's not going to.
Seems Anthony's booked himself a fight. Artur Beterbiev is a common opponent between Joe Smith and Anthony Yarde. Artur knocked the both of them out.
The rematches with both Dimitri Bivol and Artur Beterbiev, who I just mentioned, are at the top of Joe Smith Jr.'s to-do list. But if neither of those clashes can come into fruition, Smith would love to dance in the center of the ring with Anthony Yarde. I'd take that fight, said Smith to BoxingScene.com. Both Yarde and Smith have something unfortunate in common. They were both stopped by Beterbiev.
Anthony got stopped by Artur earlier this year, and Joe got stopped by Artur in June of last year. It's been over a year's time since that fight.
Wow, it's been that long. And Joe hasn't rebounded off that loss yet, you understand. He hasn't had a comeback fight, an easy one to get him back in the winner's bracket, back to his winning ways. It'll probably be difficult to get Joe back in the ring against just anybody, because, guy wants to make a certain amount of money every time he gets out there. He's not a champion anymore.
Not implying that Joe Smith Jr. is a prima donna. Far from it.
Though at the same time, there has to be a reason that over a year's time has passed and he hasn't had a rebound fight yet, a comeback fight.
You say that, Joey got knocked out. Maybe that's what's taken him so long, but Anthony Yarde got knocked out, and he's set to come back in the same calendar year.
Got knocked out earlier this year. He's set to return to action later on this year.
So when I see Joe, that it's been over a year's time since Joe fought Artur, and he hasn't come back yet, I tell myself maybe it's money related.
Taking stock of Anthony Yarde, who was recently in action with Artur Beterbiev, his ballsy performance, it didn't result in a title reign for Anthony Yarde, but it did force Joe Smith to give Yarde a standing ovation. Anthony Yarde put up a great fight with Beterbiev. He looked great.
Now Anthony Yarde is set to return to action on the undercard of Zhang versus Joyce, their rematch on September 23rd.
Immediately after the Beterbiev fight, you heard Frank Warren say that he would like to put Anthony Yarde in the ring with Joe Smith Jr. I remember that.
Looks like there's a change in plans.
Anthony Yarde has not boxed since he was stopped by unified light heavyweight champion Artur Beterbiev in January of this year, and it was the third defeat of his career and the second inside the distance loss following his 2019 knockout loss at the hands of Sergey Kovalev. Anthony Yarde has had two cracks at the apple, two opportunities to try and become a world champion, and neither of them worked out, but he did entertain a lot of people.
And that's got to count for something.
It's worth something. So you have Anthony Yarde fighting on the undercard of Joyce versus Zhang 2.
Yeah.
You have Dan Aziz and Joshua Buatsi over there on the Sky Sports side of things under the Boxer banner. They've just agreed to terms. They're supposed to be fighting, having their battle of the unbeatens. Artur Beterbiev himself, he's supposed to be fighting Callum Smith very soon. Where does that leave Joe Smith Jr.?
Guy needs a rebound fight.
I don't know. Maybe they can get him Marcus Brown. Maybe they can get him Germany's own Michael Eifert, who very recently upset the apple cart for former champion Jean Pascal in Canada.
To my knowledge, that guy's not busy with anything.
If Joe Smith Jr. would have fight that guy and beat that guy, he would become the IBF's mandatory challenger to the winner of Beterbiev versus Smith. Maybe that's a fight that Joe's people can explore.
I don't imagine you have to break the bank. I don't imagine it costs an arm and a leg to get Germany's own Michael Eifert in the ring.
I don't imagine. He may be the IBF's mandatory challenger, but for the most part, he is a fighter without a profile. And a fight with Joe Smith Jr., well, that would be another high-profile fight for Michael Eifert.
The Jean Pascal fight was a small blip on the radar. This could be another. If they can't get Michael, maybe they can make a fight between Joe Smith and Jean Pascal.
Maybe they can do that. Joe hasn't retired.
He seems to be in the market for a fight. Both those guys are coming off of losses. Make a fight between them.
Now, several divisions south of light heavyweight down there at welter, former champion Keith Thurman on impending Ugas clash. If Thurman loses, Thurman might be the next gatekeeper. Some already view Keith as a gatekeeper, not because Manny Pacquiao beat him 2 or 3 years ago or however long it's been,
4.
but it's because the man barely fights.
It's been close to 4 years since the Pacquiao fight. That was in 2019.
In the last 3 years, Keith Thurman has only fought once. You heard that right.
Right.
He's only fought once. If Thurman loses, Thurman might be the next gatekeeper, Thurman said on the Last Stand podcast with Brian Custer. If Ugas loses, Ugas is the next gatekeeper. Gatekeeper is often viewed as a disparaging word, especially its connotation is one that no fighter likes to associate themselves with. In layman's terms, it means that said fighter isn't elite, but he isn't quite at the end of his rope. He's a good litmus test for those looking to build their careers by beating a solid name. Basically, if you can make it past him, you're ready for the upper echelon. In truth, I think both Keith and Ugas, I think they're already there. I would pick Jaron Boots Ennis comfortably to beat the hell out of the both of these guys on the same night, in the same fight.
Same ring.
You climb up the ladder, you get to the top, you fall down. You don't quit just because you fall down, you try to climb up again. In that second pursuit, the second leg of a fighter's career, as you try to get back to the top, and if you fall back down again, then maybe you're never going to solidify yourself again at the top.
The problem with Keith isn't that he suffered
A loss.
his first professional loss to Manny Pacquiao 4 years ago. That's not the problem. Losses happen.
He's only got one loss. One loss on a fighter's record is hardly the end of the world. The real problem with Keith Thurman, what's always been the problem with Keith Keith Thurman is his sparse schedule of activity. The year that he fought Sean Porter, I remember that was the only fight he had that year. Many would describe that Keith Thurman as a prime Keith Thurman. And in his prime, he wasn't that active. The year he fought Sean, that was the only fight he had that year. The year he fought Danny, that was the only fight he had that year.
Took 2 years off after that, comes back, goes life or death with Josecito, loses to Manny, takes another 2 years off.
It's roughly 4 years of inactivity just right there. Terrence Crawford, ahead of the upcoming Errol Spence Jr. fight, branded Keith Thurman as irrelevant and dismissed a potential fight with him.
To me, Keith Thurman is already a gatekeeper.
He's already there. Even though he only has one professional loss, I think Crawford would beat him, Errol would beat him, Jaron Ennis would beat him, Iman Tostanionis on the right night, Radzov Butev, they might beat him.
Kind of Ben.
When asked by Brian Custa on a Last Stand podcast about Thurman's supposed desire for a fight with him, Terrence Crawford shut them down and described one time as irrelevant. Listen, everybody knows Keith Thurman is just talking. You've got to understand, Keith Thurman is the same guy who said, I'm not a real welterweight. Keith Thurman is the same guy who said, I haven't proven myself at welterweight. Keith Thurman is the same guy who has expressed that he's not interested in fighting Terrence Crawford, and Terrence is right. I remember that video from 2 or 3 years ago, where Keith in so many words said he's not interested in fighting Crawford. That was years ago.
Yeah.
Years later.
I don't think Keith Thurman is actually any more ambitious now than he was years before.
Now, all of a sudden, out of the blue, he's fiending to fight Terrence Crawford. Okay, when you're not relevant, you've got to take shots at the guys who are relevant. We don't believe you, Keith.
You know what's funny? Even though I view Keith Thurman as a gatekeeper here and now, that most any solid, ambitious welterweight would give this guy his next professional loss, what's funny about Keith is that he may soon see himself become a 2-time welterweight champion.
He might. If they do the Ugas fight and he beats Ugas, he'll be in a pole position to either challenge for the WBC title or be elevated to full champion status. I don't anticipate that the winner of Crawford versus Spence is going to stick around at welterweight any longer. I anticipate that whoever wins, they're going to vacate the titles, they're going to move up, and once those titles are vacant, Keith will be in position to pick one up, if he beats Ugas.
Is it possible for a world champion to also be a gatekeeper?
Stranger things have happened in the sport of boxing. If you ask me, the competitive fire in Keith Thurman burned out a long time ago.
Yeah.
Years ago.
Yeah.
Being dubbed a gatekeeper all boils down to perception. The perception of the boxing community at large in reference to the fighter. If Keith Thurman here today is more than just the gatekeeper, it's up to Keith Thurman to prove that he isn't.
Prove it.
It's already quite opportunistic that very soon he could be afforded a world title shot, a world title opportunity, having only boxed once in the last 2 years, 2 or 3. That's what fuels that perception, that the only reason this guy only has one professional loss is because he barely fights.
Can't lose a fight if you ain't fighting.
Question as to whether or not a gatekeeper could see himself become a world champion is contingent upon the said gatekeeper's ambition. Can he pick up a title? Can he successfully defend one? Can he perform? Because if he can, then he's not a gatekeeper.
If he can.
Keith's path to a world title, to potentially becoming a 2-time welterweight champion, is fortuitous, to say the least, opportunistic, contingent upon circumventing all risks in the welterweight division. And if he does pick up that title, what is he going to do with it?
Is he going to fight Jaron Ennis?
Alexis Rocha? Those guys are in line to become champions the same way Keith would be if he were to beat Ugas.
See if he does.